I fell in love with a priest, a man who stood before God every day, bound by sacred vows to renounce all earthly temptations. But from the moment I first laid eyes on him, I knew I was in trouble. It wasn't just attraction, it was something raw, magnetic, and impossible to deny. Each Sunday, I sat in that old wooden pew, trying to convince myself that it was just admiration, just curiosity. But every stolen glance, every accidental brush of our hands pulled me deeper into a love I wasn't supposed to feel. And when he looked back, lingering just a second too long, I knew he felt it too. What happened next would change everything. He gave me his heart, his soul, and a choice that would shatter the life he had built in God's name. The move to a secluded mountain town was a desperate attempt by my family to escape the chaos of city life. At 19, I wasn't thrilled about leaving behind everything I knew, but I tried to hide my frustration. My parents, devout and steadfast in their faith, reassured me that we'd find peace in this quiet, God-fearing place. But as I stood on the porch of our creaky old house, staring out at the dense forest that surrounded us, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a different world. The first Sunday morning in our new home, I decided to explore the town's only church. It was a modest building on the edge of the woods, its white paint peeling and the steeple slightly crooked. Yet, there was something inviting about it. As I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, I was greeted by a soft glow of sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and faint traces of incense, a comforting reminder of the church I'd left behind. I walked quietly down the aisle, the creak of my sneakers against the wooden floor echoing in the stillness. That's when I saw him. He was standing near the altar, his back turned as he adjusted a candle. His cassock was pristine black, and his movements were deliberate, almost reverent. When he turned to face me, I froze. He wasn't what I expected. He was young, maybe early 30s, with sharp features softened by an air of calm authority. His dark brown hair was neatly combed, but it was his eyes that captured me. They were piercing, like they could see right through me, and I felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady and warm. I managed to stammer out a greeting, my heart pounding in my chest. He smiled, just a brief, polite gesture, and I found myself unable to look away. There was something in his gaze, something unspoken, that sent a shiver down my spine. The service began shortly after, and I slid into a pew near the back, desperate to regain my composure. But throughout the sermon, I couldn't stop myself from stealing glances at him. The way his voice carried through the chapel, the way his hands moved as he gestured, it was mesmerizing. And as he spoke about God's love and forgiveness, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of guilt and longing. That first service lingered in my mind long after I left the church. His voice, the way he carried himself, it was all etched into my thoughts, refusing to fade. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that I was simply impressed by his devotion or inspired by his eloquence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't admiration. It was something dangerous, something I had no right to feel for a man of God. The next Sunday, I found myself arriving early, my steps quickening as I approached the church doors. I told myself I just wanted to make a good impression in the community. But as I slipped into a pew, my heart betrayed me. I scanned the altar, searching for him, and when he appeared from a side door, my pulse raced. He caught my eye for the briefest moment, and there it was again, that unspoken connection, like a thread tying us together across the room. The service began, but I barely registered the hymns or the readings. My focus was entirely on him. His voice was steady, soothing, but every word seemed to carry a weight that settled directly on my chest. He spoke about resisting temptation, about staying steadfast in faith. I should have been moved, but instead, I felt exposed, as though his words were directed at me alone. Was he trying to tell me something? Or was it my own guilty conscience playing tricks? After the service, I lingered near the exit, pretending to admire the stained glass windows. When he approached me, my breath hitched. "You're new here?" he said, his tone kind but curious. "I hope you're finding everything okay?" "Yes, Father," I replied, my voice shakier than I intended. "It's a beautiful church." He smiled, a faint dimple appearing in his cheek. "It's simple, but I think that's part of its charm. Sometimes simplicity helps us hear God more clearly." I nodded, my throat dry. His words felt layered, as though they held a meaning he wasn't saying out loud. For a moment, his gaze lingered on mine, and the world seemed to narrow, the noise of the congregation fading into the background. Then, as quickly as it began, he stepped away to greet another parishioner. Walking home that day, my thoughts were a tangled mess. I replayed every moment, every word, searching for clues. Did he feel the same pull I did, or was I imagining it? Either way, I knew I was in trouble. This wasn't just a passing crush. It was a magnetic force pulling me toward something I knew could destroy us both. The weeks passed, and every Sunday became a test of my resolve. I would sit in my usual spot, trying to focus on the service, but my eyes betrayed me, drawn to him no matter how hard I tried to resist. It wasn't just his appearance, though. His sharp jawline and piercing eyes were hard to ignore. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet strength and warmth that seemed to radiate from him. But what shook me most was the way he started looking back. At first I thought it was my imagination, a glance here, a fleeting moment there. But soon it became undeniable. During his sermons, his eyes would sweep across the congregation, but they always seemed to linger on me. It wasn't obvious, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I could feel it. Each time, it sent a jolt through me, a mix of fear and exhilaration. One evening, I decided to attend a midweek prayer meeting, hoping to blend into the small crowd. But as the session ended and people began to leave, he approached me again. "You've been coming regularly," he said, his voice soft. "I'm glad to see you're settling in." "Thank you, Father," I replied, my heart thudding in my chest. He hesitated for a moment, as though weighing his next words. "If you ever need to talk, or if you have questions, I'm here." There was something in his tone, something almost vulnerable. I wanted to say so much, to ask him what I was so afraid to admit even to myself. But instead, I nodded, thanking him politely before hurrying out into the cool night air. As I walked home, his words echoed in my mind. "I'm here." It wasn't just an offer of guidance. It felt like a promise. And despite the fear gnawing at me, I couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. The days following that evening blurred together, but his words stayed sharp in my mind. I'm here. They weren't the kind of words you forgot, not when they carried the weight of something unsaid. I spent hours replaying the moment, dissecting his tone, his expression, the way his eyes softened as they held mine. Did he mean it as a priest offering guidance, or as a man reaching out? That Sunday, I arrived earlier than usual, the church quieter than I'd ever seen it. The faint scent of wax and incense filled the air as sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. I found myself wandering toward the altar, studying the intricate carvings and golden accents. My fingers brushed the edge of the lectern, the cool metal grounding me. Lost in thought, his voice startled me, deep and soft, reverberating in the stillness. I turned quickly, my heart pounding. There he was, standing just a few feet away, his cassock falling perfectly around his frame. Up close, he seemed different, less untouchable, more human. His hair had a slight curl at the edges, and his hands were clasped loosely in front of him. "Sorry," I stammered, stepping back. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," he said, his smile gentle. "This is your church as much as mine." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, like the air before a storm. I could feel his gaze on me, and I wondered if he felt the same pull I did, the invisible thread tying us together tighter with each passing second. "I feel different here," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's quieter, more personal." "That's the beauty of small places," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "You hear things you might miss elsewhere." I wasn't sure if he was talking about the church or us. As weeks passed, the stolen moments between us grew longer, the glances more frequent. I couldn't deny it anymore, and neither could he. Each time our eyes met, there was an unspoken acknowledgement, a quiet understanding of the impossible thing we were both feeling. One Sunday, I stayed behind after the service, waiting until the last of the parishioners had filed out. My hands were clammy as I approached him, my pulse thrumming in my ears. He was tidying the altar, his movements deliberate and precise. When he noticed me, he paused, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his voice steady but softer than usual. I hesitated. The words caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? That I couldn't stop thinking about him? That I felt like I was drowning every time he looked at me? Instead, I settled on the truth, at least part of it. "I wanted to thank you," I said, my voice low, "for being so kind. It's been a hard transition." His expression softened, and he stepped closer. "Transitions are always hard," he said gently, "but you're strong. I can see that." His words hit deeper than I expected, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I nodded quickly, afraid that if I spoke, my voice would crack. He hesitated as though he wanted to say more, but instead, he reached out, his hand grazing my shoulder briefly before pulling back. That touch, so brief, so innocent, set my skin ablaze. It happened late one evening, long after the church had emptied. I had lingered again, my thoughts too loud to ignore. The dim lighting made the space feel smaller, more intimate, and when he appeared from the shadows, I felt my breath catch. "You've been quiet," he said, his tone cautious. "Is everything okay?" I shook my head, my chest tightening. Yes. I don't know." He took a step closer, his brow furrowed in concern. "You can talk to me," he said. "Whatever it is, I'll listen." The words spilled out before I could stop them. "I can't stop thinking about you." His face froze, his lips parting slightly as though he was about to speak but didn't know what to say. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to take it back, to run, but my feet refused to move. "I know it's wrong," I continued, my voice shaking, "but I can't help it. I feel drawn to you." His eyes closed briefly. And when he opened them, there was a storm of emotion there, confusion, guilt, and something else, something that mirrored the chaos inside me. "This can't happen," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "You understand that, don't you?" I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I know." But I had to tell you. For a moment, he looked like he was going to say something else, but instead, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, alone in the dim light. The days after my confession felt like a blur of regret and raw emotion. I avoided the church entirely, terrified of what I might see, or not see, if I went back. My mind was a battlefield of guilt and longing, replaying his face, his words, his silence. I told myself I'd done the right thing by staying away, but my heart ached for him, for the connection we'd shared, however brief and forbidden. I spent my afternoons walking the trails near the edge of town, hoping the solitude of the forest would quiet my thoughts. The rustling leaves and distant bird calls offered some solace, but it wasn't enough. The pull I felt toward him was stronger than any logic or sense of morality I could muster. He was in my thoughts constantly, his voice echoing in my mind like a prayer I couldn't stop repeating. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, casting the forest in a golden glow, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned quickly, expecting to see another hiker. Instead, it was him, Father Michael. His cassock was gone, replaced by simple black slacks and a dark sweater that made him look even more human, and even more unattainable. "I was worried about you," he said softly, his voice carrying over the quiet rustle of the trees. "You haven't been to church." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I thought it was better if I stayed away. His brows furrowed and he stepped closer. "Why would you think that?" "You know why," I replied, my voice barely audible. "After what I said, I didn't want to make things harder for you." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so vulnerable it made my chest ache. "You didn't make things harder," he said. "You just made me realize things I wasn't ready to face." There it was, his own confession hanging in the air between us. My breath caught, and I took a shaky step toward him. "What things?" I asked, my voice trembling. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought he might look away. But he didn't. "That I'm not as strong as I thought I was," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "That there are parts of me I've been trying to bury for years." I reached out before I could stop myself, my fingers brushing his. He didn't pull away. That fleeting touch between us might as well have been an explosion. The air around us felt charged, electric, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. His hand lingered against mine, and when he didn't pull back, I felt a rush of courage I hadn't known was in me. "I felt it too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "From the moment I saw you, I knew there was something different, something I couldn't ignore." His eyes searched mine, a storm of emotions swirling within them. "This isn't right," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You understand that, don't you?" "I don't care," I replied, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I can't keep pretending that what I feel doesn't exist, and I don't think you can either." For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but instead, he stepped closer, his proximity sending my heart into overdrive. His hand lifted slowly, trembling slightly as it hovered near my face. When his fingers finally brushed against my cheek, it felt like the world stopped spinning. I've spent my life trying to be something I'm not, he said, his voice raw with emotion. Trying to be perfect, to follow every rule, every expectation. But you make me want to break them all. I didn't realize I was crying until his thumb gently wiped a tear from my cheek. Then break them, I whispered, my voice shaking. For once, do what feels right instead of what's expected. His hand dropped, and for a moment, I thought he might walk away again. But then, without a word, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine so softly it felt like a prayer. The kiss was tentative, uncertain, but it ignited something in both of us that couldn't be contained. The kiss lingered in my mind for days, replaying over and over as though it was etched into my very soul. It wasn't just the kiss itself, it was everything it symbolized. The breaking of boundaries, the shattering of expectations, and the raw vulnerability that passed between us. But with every passing hour, the weight of what had happened grew heavier, pulling me into an endless spiral of doubt and fear. For days, I avoided going anywhere near the church. The fear of facing him, of seeing the guilt in his eyes, or worse, the rejection, was too much to bear. But even as I tried to bury myself in anything that would distract me, my thoughts always circled back to him. What was he feeling? Was he tormented by the same emotions that kept me awake at night? Late one evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, there was a knock at my door. My heart leaped into my throat as I opened it and saw him standing there, his face shadowed but unmistakably tense. He wasn't wearing his cassock, just simple dark clothes that made him seem more like a man and less like a symbol of something unattainable. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. The small living room suddenly felt suffocating, the walls closing in as he stood there, looking out of place and unsure. He hesitated before speaking, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I couldn't stay away," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "I thought I could, but I can't. Not after what happened." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "I didn't mean to complicate things for you," I said, my voice trembling. I couldn't keep pretending." "It's not your fault," he said quickly, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "This is my struggle too. I've spent my life following rules, living a life that was chosen for me before I even understood what it meant. And now I don't know if I can keep doing it." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and before I knew it, I was stepping closer to him. "You don't have to," I said, my voice firm despite the tears welling in my eyes. "You can choose something else. You can choose us." He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his eyes searching mine as though looking for something he couldn't find. Then, slowly, he reached out, his hand trembling as it touched my face. "You don't know what you're asking of me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "If I do this, if I choose you, I lose everything." "Then don't choose me," I said, even as my heart shattered at the words. "But don't live a lie either. You deserve to be happy, Michael." The sound of his name on my lips seemed to break something inside him. He closed the distance between us, his arms wrapping around me as though I was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. And when he kissed me this time, it wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was desperate, filled with years of longing and unspoken words. That night, everything changed. We stayed together for hours, talking in hushed voices about dreams and fears, about the life he'd lived and the one he secretly longed for. I saw sides of him I never expected. The man behind the priest, the human beneath the collar. And as the sun began to rise, casting golden light through the curtains, he made a decision that would alter the course of both our lives. "I can't go back," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil I knew he felt. "I can't stand at that altar and preach about a life I don't believe in anymore." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm choosing you," he said, his eyes locking with mine. "But if we do this, we have to leave together." The weight of his words hit me like a freight train. He was willing to give up everything, his faith, his community, his identity, for me. It was overwhelming and terrifying, but as I looked into his eyes, I knew I couldn't let him do it alone. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We'll leave." The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and secrecy. Michael packed what little he could carry, leaving behind his cassock and collar as though shedding the skin of a life he no longer wanted. I made arrangements for us to slip away unnoticed, avoiding the prying eyes of the small town community that would undoubtedly judge and condemn us if they knew the truth. The night we left, the sky was clear, the stars shining brighter than I'd ever seen. We walked hand in hand down the empty streets, our breaths visible in the cool night air. It felt surreal, like stepping into a dream or a nightmare. As we reached the edge of town where the forest loomed dark and silent, Michael stopped and turned to me. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice laced with both hope and fear. I nodded, squeezing his hand. I've never been more sure of anything. And with that, we stepped into the unknown, leaving behind the lives we'd known for the chance at something neither of us thought we could have: freedom and each other. We started over in a small, quiet town, far from the eyes of anyone who knew us. Life was simple: modest meals, shared moments, and a future we were building one day at a time. Michael adjusted slowly, learning to embrace the man he was outside the church. For the first time, we weren't hiding, and that freedom made all the difference. One evening by the lake, as the stars reflected in the water, Michael held my hand and smiled. "I gave up everything," he said softly, "and I'd do it again." We didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, it felt like ours, together. So what did you think of our story? Was the ending what you hoped for, or did it leave you wanting more? We'd love to know. Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us your favorite part of the journey. On a scale from 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this. Your support means everything to us, and we can't wait to bring you more tales of love, courage, and the choices that define us. See you in the next one.